The year is 1392. Paris lies hushed beneath a heavy summer night, the Seine reflecting torchlight like molten fire. Deep inside the Louvre Palace, a man sits alone. He is not just any man. He is the King of France, Charles VI, 24 years old, crowned with lilies, anointed by holy oil, chosen by God, but tonight he trembles. The great hall around him feels like a cage of brittle glass. His own body, he insists, is no longer flesh and bone but fragile crystal. He wraps himself in thick furs, even in the sweltering heat, terrified that the smallest touch, a stumble, a brush against a stone pillar, might shatter him into 1,000 glittering shards. The courtiers whisper outside his chamber. They have seen him like this before. Sometimes he forgets his own name, screaming that assassins are at the door. Other nights he prowls the halls, sword in hand, hunting phantoms only he can see. Once, he even failed to recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, calling her an impostor sent to deceive him. And yet, this broken, trembling figure is the ruler of one of the mightiest kingdoms in Europe, a land already crippled by decades of war with England, its people crushed under famine, plague, and endless taxes. He was not always like this. Once he was Charles the Beloved, a boy king who brought hope of renewal to a weary France. But fate, or perhaps madness itself, turned him into Charles the Mad. His mind would fracture at the very moment his country needed him most, plunging France into civil war, tearing it apart from within, and leaving it vulnerable to the crushing English victory at Agincourt. This is the story of the king who thought he was made of glass, whose madness destroyed not only his family, but the very future of France. Picture Paris in 1380. Bells ring from every cathedral tower, echoing across the rooftops of a city still healing from plague and war. Inside the grand cathedral of Rheims, an 11-year-old boy kneels before the altar. Priests chant in Latin, incense clouds the air, and as the crown of Charlemagne is lowered onto his head, the child becomes Charles VI, King of France. His people call him Le Bien-Aimé, the Beloved. After decades of misrule under his grandfather John II and his father Charles V, France is weary, but the sight of the handsome boy king fills the nation with hope. Charles was born in December 1368, the son of Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon. His father, known as the Wise, had rebuilt France's strength after catastrophic defeats in the Hundred Years' War. When Charles V died in 1380, the crown passed to his son, but the boy was far too young to rule. For 8 years, regents governed in his name, his uncles, powerful men from the royal house of Valois, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Bourbon, and Anjou. These uncles enriched themselves shamelessly, taxing the people to fill their own treasuries. Paris grew restless. Riots broke out, and ordinary citizens whispered prayers for the day when their young king would come of age. That day arrived in 1388. Charles, now 20, took the reins of power himself. He dismissed his greedy uncles and recalled his father's old counselors, wise administrators known as the marmosets. These men believed in reform, in strengthening the crown and easing the burden on the poor. Taxes were reduced, justice was reformed, and the royal court once again gleamed with dignity. The people rejoiced. Chroniclers of the time wrote of a golden beginning, when the young king was truly beloved, seen as a savior who might restore France's lost glory. But even in these bright years, shadows lingered. Charles was married to Isabeau of Bavaria, a foreign princess barely 14 when she arrived in Paris. At first, their union brought joy. Isabeau was charming, fertile, and quickly bore children. The court glittered with feasts and tournaments, the king and queen riding side by side in splendid processions through Paris. Yet, beneath the music and pageantry, trouble brewed. France's nobles remained divided. The English war simmered on, draining the treasury. And most ominously, something stirred within the young king himself. A hidden flaw in his bloodline, whispered about in hushed voices, a curse that would soon reveal itself. For Charles came from a family haunted by madness. His mother, Joanna of Bourbon, had been prone to nervous breakdowns and long periods of melancholy. Relatives on both sides of his family tree had suffered strange fits, delusions, and melancholy spells. No one spoke of it openly, for to question the king's sanity was treason. But those who knew the family best feared that one day the curse would awaken in Charles. That day came sooner than anyone could have imagined. In 1392, as Charles led his army through the forests of Brittany, something inside him broke, and when it did, France itself would begin to unravel. The summer of 1392 was suffocating, the kind of heat that made tempers short and horses restless. Charles VI rode at the head of his army, his armor gleaming as they wound through the dense forests of Brittany. He was leading a campaign against a rebellious noble, Olivier de Clisson, an enemy who had defied royal authority. The king appeared confident, steady in the saddle, but those close to him noticed something unsettling. His eyes seemed distant, his manner distracted, as if unseen voices were whispering at the edge of his mind. Then, without warning, it happened. A ragged figure burst from the trees, a half-crazed leper who seized the king's bridle and cried out, "Ride no further, noble king! You are betrayed!" Guards dragged the man away, but the words struck Charles like a thunderbolt. His face went pale. He muttered prayers under his breath, sweat pouring down his temples despite the shade. Hours later, as the column marched deeper into the forest, a clattering noise shattered the silence. A squire had dropped his lance against his comrade's helmet. The sound rang like a spark in dry tinder. Charles gave a sudden scream, his eyes wild, and drew his sword. Before anyone could react, he turned on his own men, hacking at them with savage fury. Knights who had fought beside him for years reeled back in shock. He struck down several soldiers, the blade flashing again and again until it dripped red. His closest companions rushed to restrain him, but Charles fought like a man possessed, his strength fueled by a madness no mortal could resist. Finally, it took several knights to drag him from his horse, pin him to the ground, and wrench the sword from his hands. When the fit passed, the king lay trembling, his body slick with sweat. He seemed not to recognize anyone around him. Not his generals, not his cousins, not even his closest friend. He stared into the trees with hollow eyes, whispering that demons were pursuing him. The campaign ended immediately. The army turned back to Paris, carrying their broken king, no longer Charles the Beloved, but something entirely different. Chroniclers wrote that when he returned to the capital, he was pale, gaunt and silent, staring at the ground like a lost soul. For days, he refused to speak or eat. Then, when words finally came, they were nonsense. He called himself Saint George, protector of England, not King of France. He forgot his wife, screaming that Isabeau was a trickster sent to deceive him. Sometimes he would not recognize his children. Other times he ran through the corridors howling that enemies were hiding in the shadows. His doctors, learned men schooled in Galen and Aristotle, tried every cure, bleeding, herbs, charms, pilgrimages. None worked. The king's madness came in waves. Sometimes he seemed lucid, even capable of ruling, but then a fit would seize him without warning. Courtiers walked in terror, never knowing when their sovereign might burst into rage or collapse into despair. One delusion became infamous. Charles insisted that his body was made of glass. He wrapped himself in thick furs to avoid breaking, refused to be touched, and demanded iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent shattering. He moved carefully through his chambers, terrified that a stumble would reduce him to glittering shards on the marble floor. To see the most powerful man in France creep about like a fragile ornament filled the court with horror. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was a national catastrophe, France was a kingdom at war, and now its king was a broken vessel, unfit to command. His uncle seized power once more, hungry for control, while Queen Isabeau, still barely 20, struggled to hold together a crumbling court. The crown was beginning to slip, and the kingdom teetered on the edge of disaster. Paris, January 1393. The Louvre glitters with torches, laughter, and music. The court has gathered for a masquerade ball, the Bal des Ardents, the dance of the burning men. The occasion is meant to lift spirits after months of gloom, celebrating the remarriage of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau. The city outside shivers in winter frost, but inside, the great hall is a riot of color, silk, and wine. Nobles in masks twirl across polished floors, the air thick with incense and the sweet scent of spilled wine. Charles VI, still only 24, insists on joining the revelry. Tonight, he feels well, freed for once from the shadows that stalk his mind. To amuse the court, he and 5 young companions decide on a prank. They will dress as wild men, mythical figures said to roam the forests of Europe, half human, half beast. Servants smear their bodies with resin and pitch, then stitch them into costumes of coarse flax and hemp that bristle like animal fur. The disguises are convincing, their faces hidden, their movements jerky and strange. The wild men burst into the hall, leaping and howling, to the delight of the court. Laughter roars as they prance and shriek, rattling chains and lunging at guests. Queen Isabeau, seated on a raised dais, claps her hands in glee, unaware of the horror about to unfold. Then, the Duke of Orleans, the king's own brother, arrives late. He has been drinking heavily. In his hand, he carries a torch, its flame licking upward as he pushes through the crowd to see the spectacle. Courtiers shout warnings. The costumes are soaked in pitch, but the Duke waves them off, laughing. He raises his torch to peer at the faces of the wild men. The flame catches. In an instant, the hall erupts in screams. The resin-soaked flax explodes into fire, turning the dancers into human torches. The king himself is among them, his costume blazing. One companion collapses, writhing in agony as flames consume him. Another runs shrieking through the hall, spreading fire to the draperies. Women faint, men shout orders. The music shatters into chaos. The smell of burning flesh mingles with smoke and perfume. Charles might have perished then and there, but one quick-witted lady-in-waiting, the Duchess of Berry, acts without hesitation. She flings her skirts over him, smothering the flames, beating at the fire with her bare hands until it dies. The king is left shaken, singed but alive. 4 of his companions are not so fortunate. They die in agony, their screams echoing for hours afterward in the palace. The people of Paris are outraged. To them, this is no accident. It is a sign of God's judgment. The king, already tainted by madness, has now danced with fire and death in the very heart of his court. Pamphlets spread, whispering of divine punishment, of a monarch cursed. Charles's reputation, once the beloved, begins to transform into the mad. His subjects begin to wonder if their king has lost not only his reason, but heaven's favor as well. From that night on, the mask of dignity slips further. His fits grow worse, his absences from governance longer. The queen, Isabeau, begins to assert herself, stepping into the void left by her husband's broken mind. But her rising power breeds enemies, and the rival factions of France circle like wolves. What began as a private tragedy is becoming a public crisis, one that will plunge the kingdom into civil war. After the disaster of the Bal des Ardents, Charles VI was never the same. His fits grew longer, darker, and more unpredictable. Sometimes he would vanish into silence, staring at walls for days. Other times he would sprint through the palace corridors, sword in hand, convinced assassins were hiding in every shadow. He forgot his own name, his own crown, even his own family. Once he pushed his wife away, screaming that she was not the queen at all but an impostor sent to trick him. The realm could not wait for his lucidity to return. France needed leadership, and into that void stepped Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She had arrived in Paris as a teenager, bright-eyed and elegant, but now she hardened into a formidable political figure. At first she ruled cautiously, working with Charles's uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Orleans, but alliances in medieval France were quicksand. Every noble wanted control of the crown through the broken king. At the center of the struggle stood two men, Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, charismatic and ambitious. He believed that as Charles's blood relative, he should guide the kingdom. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and later his son John the Fearless, wealthy beyond measure, controlling vast lands in Flanders and Burgundy. They saw themselves as protectors of France, but their true loyalty was to their own dynasty. Isabeau played a dangerous game, sometimes allying with Orleans, sometimes leaning on Burgundy. To her enemies, this made her seem corrupt, even immoral. Whispered rumors began that she was the Duke of Orleans' mistress, that she betrayed her husband's bed while he wandered the halls babbling. Chroniclers, often funded by her rivals, painted her as a schemer, the German woman who sold France. In truth, she was fighting to keep the kingdom from splintering apart, but the mud clung to her reputation for centuries. The people of Paris, suffering under famine and taxation, grew restless. The royal treasury was empty, the war with England simmered on, and French armies bled coin as well as men. Every time Charles seemed to recover, hope rose that he might take the reins again. But inevitably, the madness returned, dragging France deeper into chaos. By the early 1400s, the struggle between Orleans and Burgundy boiled over. In November 1407, the unthinkable happened. Louis of Orleans was hacked to death in the streets of Paris, ambushed by assassins hired by John the Fearless. His skull was split with an axe, his body mutilated, until even his retainers could barely recognize him. Paris trembled with horror. John the Fearless did not deny the killing. He justified it. He claimed Orleans had bewitched the king with sorcery, that he had dishonored Queen Isabeau, that his death was righteous vengeance. Astonishingly, many believed him. Some even praised him as a savior of France. But Orleans' followers swore revenge, rallying under the banner of his son Charles. The kingdom split in two: the Armagnacs, loyal to the murdered duke's family, and the Burgundians, loyal to John the Fearless. The king, lost in his delusions, could do nothing. Sometimes he declared loyalty to one side, sometimes the other, sometimes neither at all. France was now a house without a master, its ruler alive but absent, like a candle guttering in the wind. Civil war raged in the streets of Paris. Armagnac mobs clashed with Burgundian militias. At night, screams echoed from alleys as bodies were dumped into the Seine. The people who had once called their sovereign Charles the Beloved now muttered only one name: Charles the Mad. And as Frenchmen slaughtered Frenchmen, across the Channel, England watched with cold, patient eyes. While France tore itself apart, England sharpened its sword. Across the Channel, Henry V of England had ascended to the throne in 1413. He was young, ruthless, and burning with ambition. He saw clearly what every observer knew: France was a kingdom divided, its king incapacitated, its nobles at each other's throats. For England, this was opportunity. Henry revived the old Plantagenet claim to the French crown, once pressed by Edward III, and prepared for invasion. In 1415, he landed in Normandy with an army of 12,000. The French, distracted by civil war, stumbled into a half-hearted response. When they finally mustered to confront Henry, their numbers dwarfed his own. Some chroniclers say 30,000, others nearly 60,000. The flower of French nobility assembled, armored knights, banners snapping in the wind, their confidence so high they mocked the small English host. The confrontation came on October 25th, the feast of St. Crispin, near the village of Agincourt. The battlefield was a muddy strip of farmland hemmed in by forests. Rain had turned the ground to thick sludge. The French knights, brilliant in their plate armor, prepared to crush the English once and for all. But Henry had other plans. He lined his men with longbowmen, thousands of archers carrying the dreaded English longbow, capable of piercing armor at astonishing range. The French charged, but the mud swallowed their horses, the arrows fell like rain, and chaos erupted. Knights slipped, fell, and were trampled by their own comrades. Those who reached the English lines were exhausted, only to be cut down by soldiers fighting with axes and knives. The slaughter was merciless. French noble after noble fell into the mire, their armor dragging them down like anchors. Among the dead were dukes, counts, and the pride of France's chivalry. The Armagnac-Burgundian feud had left the kingdom unprepared, and now the cream of its aristocracy was butchered in the mud of Agincourt. Back in Paris, the news struck like a hammer. The people wailed that God himself had abandoned France. Charles VI, trapped in one of his delusional fugues, could not even comprehend what had happened. Some days he believed he was a peasant, others a saint, others made entirely of glass. His throne stood empty while England marched ever deeper into his kingdom. Henry pressed his advantage. By 1419 he controlled much of Normandy. Then came his boldest move. He sought not merely victory, but the crown itself. Through negotiation and intimidation, he forced Queen Isabeau and her Burgundian allies into the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. The terms were unthinkable. Henry V would marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and upon Charles's death, Henry, not the Dauphin, Charles's son, would inherit the throne of France. In a single stroke, Charles VI was disinherited in all but name. His own wife had signed away their dynasty's future. The Dauphin, furious, refused to accept the treaty, but his words meant little. France's king was mad, its queen compromised, its nobles divided, its armies broken, and the crown of France now seemed destined to pass to an English monarch. For Charles VI, trapped in his hallucinations, there was no awareness of the enormity. Sometimes he would clutch at priests, weeping that he had lost his soul. Other times he declared that angels were guiding him. On his clearer days he wandered gardens in silence, fragile as a shadow, unaware that the crown upon his head had already slipped away. By the 1420s, France was a kingdom in fragments. Its king wandered the corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris, muttering to himself, wrapped in layers of cloth to protect his glass body. Its queen, Isabeau, reviled by the people, was branded a traitor for siding with the English. Its nobility split between Armagnacs and Burgundians, each spilling French blood in the streets while foreign armies advanced. Charles VI had become a hollow figure, a monarch only in name. On good days, he would sit in council, speaking with sudden clarity, as though nothing were wrong. He might ask after taxes, war, or the welfare of his children, giving hope that he had recovered. But as quickly as the light came, it vanished. He would collapse into silence, staring at the floor, or wander the palace gardens whispering to unseen companions. Once, he insisted that he was no king at all, but merely George, the blacksmith's apprentice. Another time he refused to bathe for months, convinced water would shatter his fragile body. The people's love turned to despair. To them, Charles was cursed. Pamphlets circulated calling him not Charles le Bien-Aimé, the beloved, but Charles le Folle, the mad. Priests preached that his illness was God's punishment for the sins of France. The peasants groaned under endless war taxes, only to see their armies crushed, their lands burned, and their king absent from the world. In 1422, death came at last. Charles was 53 years old, though he looked much older, worn, broken, almost ghostly. He lay in his bed at the Hotel Saint-Paul, Paris, muffled in autumn rain. His court was divided, his wife estranged, his son disinherited. Outside his chamber, messengers whispered of Henry V's sudden death in England, fate's strange irony that the conqueror who had claimed France would not live to wear its crown. Charles slipped in and out of consciousness. At times he prayed, at times he raved. When the end came on October 21st, it was quiet. The king who had once been beloved, who had danced with fire, who had thought himself made of glass, breathed his last. His funeral was poorly attended. The people of Paris, exhausted and embittered, barely mourned him. His body was carried to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the resting place of French kings, but the grandeur of the procession was muted. Chroniclers wrote that he was buried not as a beloved sovereign, but as a broken relic of a broken kingdom. Yet his death left France in even greater peril. By the Treaty of Troyes, the crown should have passed to the infant Henry VI of England, grandson of Charles VI. But in the south, the Dauphin Charles VII, disinherited yet defiant, rallied his supporters. The civil war would continue. And within a decade, a peasant girl from Domremy named Joan of Arc would rise, claiming visions of saints, and carry the Dauphin to Rheims to be crowned. But that is another story. For Charles VI, history left a haunting legacy. He began as a golden boy, crowned in hope, named the Beloved. He ended as the Mad King, betrayed by his own blood, abandoned by his people, remembered not for victories or triumphs, but for his fragile mind and his shattered reign. Charles VI of France is one of those figures history cannot forget, yet almost wishes it could. His reign was a mirror of contradiction, a boy crowned in hope, a man broken in madness, a monarch whose very body became a symbol of fragility. His delusions of being made of glass still echo across centuries, a haunting metaphor for a kingdom that shattered under the weight of war, betrayal, and despair. His tragedy was not only personal. When his mind fractured, France itself fractured with him. Civil war erupted between Armagnacs and Burgundians, fueled not by principle, but by the power vacuum of an absent king. While French blood spilled in Parisian alleys, England struck with cold precision, delivering humiliation at Agincourt and claiming the French crown through the Treaty of Troyes. Charles was alive but absent, a sovereign whose crown slipped silently from his brow while he wandered gardens muttering prayers to angels only he could hear. Even his memory was divided. To some he was Charles the Beloved, the boy who once promised renewal. To most, he became Charles the Mad, cursed by God, a warning of how frailty at the top can doom a nation. His queen was condemned as a traitor, his dynasty nearly extinguished, his children disinherited by the stroke of a pen. And yet, through the wreckage, France endured. Out of the ashes of his reign came Joan of Arc, the Dauphin's coronation at Rheims, and eventually the rebirth of a kingdom that would drive the English from its soil. Charles VI did not live to see redemption. His story is not one of victory but of fragility, the story of a king who became a prisoner of his own mind, whose madness was not only his burden but his country's. When he was laid to rest at Saint-Denis, the people turned away, but his ghost lingers still in the corridors of history, a king of glass broken long before his death, whose shadow taught France a bitter lesson, that the fate of nations can rest upon the fragile mind of one man.